everyone, I hope you guys are doing well. I hope that your Pesach week was a meaningful week, and I hope that you were able to utilize the last few days of Pesach as a time where you can get a new revelation, a new connection, or learn something new about Messiah. As we know, those last few days of Pesach are of course times when we get a special connection with the soul of Messiah. So I hope you guys were able to experience that in your Pesach Day 7 and Pesach Day 8 meals. And for those of you that had the meal of Messiah, I hope you guys really enjoyed it. I hope you were able to dance on the tables. Please send me photos if you did. But anyway, I hope you guys really enjoyed your Pesach. Right, now that Pesach is finished, it feels kind of like, let's be honest, it feels like you've overcome a big challenge in life, right? It's a journey, it's a challenge to make it through those 7 days without any chametz, right? I'm trying to think what you're going to cook and what you're going to make for a menu for this week. So it's more than just redemption from Egypt. It's more than just the splitting of the seas. Now that we've made it through Pesach, it's also a splitting of the fridge and a splitting of the cupboards in the kitchen. Everything's open again. We can finally start eating chametz again, right? And it's not just a spiritual freedom, but it's also now a dietary freedom that we've entered as we've made it through Pesach. We can finally unpack everything. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen this thing going around, these online challenges on social media, where people are eating raw eggs and cups of sugar and a drink of alcohol and challenging each other. Well, forget about that. This week's parasha gives us a different challenge. It's called the kosher challenge. That in itself is a challenge, right? We thought that you made it through Pesach and all the challenges. Come and open this parasha and you got new challenges reminding us of the kosher laws. Hopefully this one, the kosher laws, will also go viral. Now, the bad news is that Elijah did not come to our Seders this year in the sense of announcing the final redemption and the coming of Messiah. But the good news is that we are still alive and that we have a Shabbat to look ahead to. And that on the Shabbat that's ahead of us, we are able to study a new parasha and we are able to get a new connection to Hashem and learn something more about our Creator. So we need to be excited about this. We need to be learning with expectant hearts every single time we open the Torah. And you know, if you think about it, the Exodus from Egypt, I mean, we just recently studied Pesach Day 7, the splitting of the sea. And what happened after the sea split and the Egyptians drowned on the seashore? It tells us Miriam and all the ladies took up their tambourines and sang songs and danced. So our sages asked the question, well, where on earth did they get tambourines? We were supposed to be busy running for our lives in the desert. Where did they get musical instruments from? And the explanation is that they prepared those instruments already in Egypt. While we were in exile down there, in our slavery, the ladies were expecting the redemption to come at any time. So while they were in lockdown, they already did as much as possible to prepare themselves for that redemption. They yearned for that redemption. They had an expectant heart. So I think that we too should learn from that during our lockdown right now, that we should also be studying with an expectant heart, knowing that soon and in our days we'll be able to return to our shuls and we'll be able to learn together again. Right? Now that doesn't mean, with the lockdown, it doesn't mean you can sit at home and say, you know what, when shul begins again, then I'll just catch up. For the rest of the time, you're going to sit and do nothing, count my toes, and do weird videos for this lockdown. No, you're supposed to study while you're at home as well, right? The Pirkei Avot tells us this thing. Rabbi Hillel, the famous Hillel, tells us, one who does not increase his knowledge loses it. So you can't say, okay, well, my spiritual life is on pause now that I can't go to shul anymore, right? Because if you don't increase your knowledge, it's not going to stay at the level it was when you left here. It's going to decrease day by day. Every day of Torah learning that you forego puts you another step backwards. So by the time that you eventually decide to open up the Torah and study it again, you're already in the negative. You have forgotten so much. So make it a cause. Make a time during your day that you can set aside specifically for Torah study, right? And if you have kids, good luck. Try and do it before they wake up or as they go to sleep. But I understand the difficulties of being a homeschool parent now all of a sudden. Okay, so this week's parasha is chock-a-block with events, right? It starts off where we left off a few weeks ago with the priests, the Kohanim, all stuck in quarantine inside the tabernacle. Remember, they had to stay in there for 7 days during the preparation for the inauguration of the tabernacle. And in this week's parasha, it starts off by saying, what's the name of the parasha? Shemini. What does Shemini mean? The 8th day. So after the 7-day quarantine, on the 8th day, finally the quarantine for the priests is over and they can start the inauguration of the tabernacle. You know, I hope that the fact that this is the parasha this week will be a good sign, a good omen for us, that we too will come out of quarantine sometime soon. So to mark the inauguration of the tabernacle, the priests bring a whole litany of different sacrifices, right? They bring the sacrifices. Aaron goes in front of the congregation, and what does Aaron do? He lifts his hands like this, and he blesses the congregation. Right, you see, like that. I can't do it properly. I can't do it with the blessings anyway, because I'm not a Cohen, so I'm not allowed to do it. But anyway, he lifts his hands and he gives the priestly blessing upon the nation. It's a momentous time. And we're going to read about that whole section again when we get to the book of Numbers, where we actually find the actual text that was used when he made the blessing. Right, after that, God makes an appearance. Right, and how does he appear in this week's parasha? It's an amazing sight. He comes blazing forth in fire out of the tabernacle, consumes the sacrifices in front of everybody. And the people that saw this must have been completely in awe. It's an amazing thing. But that spiritual awe that they were feeling quickly turned into grief, as Aaron's 2 sons, Nadav and Avihu, end up dying in the tabernacle for bringing a strange fire. Right? And that, of course, leads God to giving the Levites some more commandments, like, for example, not to enter the tabernacle or do any service if they have had any alcohol. They're not allowed to do any service if they are intoxicated. Something we, of course, can connect with now, as our country is also in an alcoholic lockdown, just like the parasha. There's so many connections. Anyway, so the rest of the parasha, after that, deals with the laws of kosher animals, the laws of kashrut. So land animals, for example, have to have a split hoof. You see, like Aaron did his hand thing. They need to have a split hoof, and they, of course, need to ruminate. They need to chew the cud. Sea animals need to have both fins and scales, right? So when we crossed the sea, at the splitting of the sea, that was our last chance to stick our hand into the wall of water and grab some lobster and shrimp before we got to Mount Sinai. Right, the kosher birds in this week's parasha are listed by name. Sorry, the unkosher ones are listed by name. And surprise, surprise, the bat is mentioned as one of those things that is not food. I wonder why. No? You guys know why China doesn't have a cricket team? Because they ate all the bats. No, that's why they don't have a cricket team. By the way, crickets are kosher. You read this parasha if you look closely. Anyway, so this is our parasha in a kosher nutshell. There's a lot going on in this parasha. So today, for today's study, I want to bring something that connects us with the time of year that we are in now as well, as we have just come out of Pesach. And so that we can take that energy from Pesach, that separation, that devotion that we show to Hashem from Pesach, and use it in the coming days. Because we are now not just forgetting about the festivals, we are now in a time where we are building up to the next festival, to the next Yom Tov, which is 40-something days away from now, right? Which is, of course, Shavuot. In English, it is called Pentecost. And how are we doing this? How are we preparing ourselves? Every single day, we are counting the day by counting the Omer. Okay, and we count the Omer all the way up until Shavuot, which means there are how many Sabbaths between now and Shavuot? There are 6 Sabbaths, right? Pesach was a whole 7 days long. There was the first Sabbath of the 49 days in there. And now we have 6 Sabbaths left until we get to Shavuot. Shavuot this year, by the way, interestingly, falls on a Friday. But that's Shavuot day 1. So that means that the Saturday this year is going to be Shavuot day 2 for those of us outside of Israel. So this year, please God, we'll be able to gather again at Shul, hopefully. Then we will be able to do 2 days of Shavuot for the first time in many years. We usually skip the second day if it's not on a Sabbath. But this year, we'll be able to do it if we are able to come to Shul. So that'll be pretty exciting. That'll be something new. A new Torah for us on that Shavuot, on that Shabbat. Okay, now there are various ways that we can work on ourselves during these 6 weeks to prepare ourselves for Shavuot. Because this is a tradition, right? It's based upon the fact that the Israelites had to prepare themselves for 3 days before Shavuot to receive the Torah. So too what we do is we use this time between Pesach and Shavuot to prepare ourselves so that every year when we arrive at Shavuot, we can say that we merit to receive the Torah anew. So some ways that we do this is that we use this 49-day period, or at least the counting of the Omer after Pesach, to focus on a different character trait within ourselves each week. We work on ourselves, right? A different midah each week. Some people do a different one every single day for all 49 days of the Omer. Other people read through the entire book of Psalms. And in fact, we've actually done a little bit of Psalms, right? Every single day we're reading Psalm 67 as we count the Omer. And then there is an age-old tradition that we do during this time to work on ourselves, which is to study writing a part of the Mishnah, part of the Talmud, known as the Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers. Because what that does is that it teaches us about being a good person, about being a mensch. Because remember, the Torah was given to human beings. It was not given to animals. So during this time, we were preparing ourselves to receive the Torah. We've got to work on ourselves to make sure we don't behave like animals, that we behave like human beings who can, in fact, receive God's revelation through the Torah. Okay, so the Pirkei Avot that we'll be studying through the 6 weeks is itself perfectly 6 chapters long, which works out nicely. So you can do a chapter each week building up to Shavuot. Now, the tradition of reading the Pirkei Avot on Sabbath afternoons originated up in the Northern Hemisphere, right? And the reason why they did it there was because this time of year in the Northern Hemisphere, the days are getting longer and longer. So their Sabbath afternoons are getting longer and longer. They've got more time to study Torah. So they thought, well, why not study the Pirkei Avot during this time? For us in the Southern Hemisphere, right, we have got to squeeze it in as our afternoons are getting shorter and shorter at this time. I don't know if you've been noticing that Havdalah has been getting sooner and sooner in the evenings. Okay, but I encourage all of you, while we're in this lockdown, for the next, I don't know how many Sabbaths we're going to be stuck at home, to use your Sabbath afternoons reading the Pirkei Avot, studying the Pirkei Avot. You know, just reading the text itself in the Siddur, the Pirkei Avot is so powerful that it will really do something to you, right? If you have any commentaries available to you, right, or even notice in the Siddur itself, it's got commentaries at the bottom of the page on some of the Mishnahs of the Pirkei Avot. Read them as well, study them as well. There's so much for us to learn in the Pirkei Avot. So I really encourage you guys to spend every Sabbath afternoon for these 6 weeks at least reading the full chapter of the Pirkei Avot. Some of them get really long. So you're gonna have a lot to learn, to study, and to read on that day. And you'll enjoy it, trust me. It will really change the way you think. So it's in our Siddur on page 640, right? The whole Pirkei Avot is there, all 6 chapters, and there's commentary, plus, originally the Pirkei Avot was only 5 chapters. That's actually how many chapters it is in the Talmud. But then they added a 6th chapter that came from another part of the Talmud, just to help us during our study in the 6 weeks to make it all fit together. So I hope you guys will be able to do that and that you'll enjoy it. It's on page 640 in the Siddur. In addition to that, I've also sent out a link for you guys, and I'll be sending out the new one every week with our newsletter, to be able to listen to a audio series that discusses the connections between the Pirkei Avot and the similarities to the sayings of Yeshua. I've already sent it out, but I'll keep sending them out as well. A good friend of mine was able to put that together. There's so many links between the teachings of Yeshua and the Pirkei Avot. In fact, if you just go read Matthew chapter 5, just go read that Sermon on the Mount, actually read the whole chapter, you'll notice that itself is as if it is the ethics of Yeshua. It's an amazing section to read, and everything you read in there, you're going to find in the Pirkei Avot as well. So learn that. Yeshua teaches us about what type of people we need to be, what type of attitudes to have. They say that if you have an attitude of telling everyone around you to buzz off, it's called the bee attitude. So you can read Matthew chapter 5. I think it's called the Beatitudes. Okay, so today I want to look at a verse in our parashah and see what the Pirkei Avot can teach us about this verse. I want to get us started off on the Pirkei Avot, started on a good foot, so that we are able to study this in the coming weeks. So I'm going to look at Aaron's reaction after his 2 sons died in the tabernacle. Moses approaches him, and Moses wants to give him words of comfort. And I want to study that today and see if maybe we can learn something from Aaron, and maybe they can apply to us as believers, and whenever we have suffering or troubles coming our way. So here's the verse. It's Leviticus 10 verse 3. It starts off by saying, Moshe said to Aaron, "This is what Hashem has said. Through those who are near me, I will be consecrated. And before all the people, I will be glorified. And then it says, Aaron kept silent. That's a weird verse. Aaron kept silent. So what do you think this tells us about Aaron? The fact that he kept silent after just witnessing his 2 sons dying and hearing this comfort from Moses. Well, our sages have got different ideas, and quite opposite ideas, as to what this tells us about Aaron, right? Some of our commentators argue that this is a sign of his anger, of his displeasure, his dismay at what happened, that he now gives Moses the silent treatment after Moses tries to comfort him, right? But other commentators go and credit this to him, saying that his silence was in fact a sign that he accepted the heavenly decree. So I want to discuss this today, right? Now, those that say it was a sign of anger, ask the question, which is an inevitable question, right? How is it that the punishment of someone who did something wrong, a sinner or a wrongdoer, can be seen as a good thing for them? Right? I mean, what does it say? Moses says that they were drawn closer to God. How does that work? When someone sins and gets killed for it, how do they get closer to God? Isn't it supposed to take you away from God? It's a very difficult verse to actually understand. But on the opposite end, Rashi, for example, who says that Aaron's silence was the right reaction, points out that God actually rewards Aaron for his silence. If you jump down to verse 8, you'll see that instead of the usual formula where it says God spoke to Moses, tell Aaron and his sons, in verse 8, God addresses Aaron directly without using Moses as a mediator. And Rashi says, and a few other commentators in the Midrash also point out that this is a reward for Aaron's reaction to when Moses came to share those words with him. And in fact, it was the right reaction. And if you think about it really deeply, right? Maybe Aaron was comforted by those words that Moses said to him. Those of you that have children, let me ask you this question. Answer yourself. What is it that you wish the most for your own children in the future? Above all else. Think about this, right? Do you want them to have a wonderful education, good health, a wonderful spouse? Do you want them to be financially independent? Those things are important, but what is the most important thing that you want to instill into your children that they can benefit from in the future? It is that they will be close, they will be drawn near to Hashem. That trumps every other thing that you wish for your own child, that they would draw near to Hashem. And guess what? That's exactly what Moses says to Aaron happened to his sons, Nadav and Avihu. Right? Moses says those very words. Through those who are near me, I will be consecrated. And before all the people, I will be glorified. So maybe that is an answer to the fact that the question of what does it mean when Aaron kept silent. Maybe he was in fact comforted by these words of Moses to realize that his 2 sons, who he had so much hope for, eventually still got what he hoped for, that they will draw near to Hashem. It's a different way to look at the tragedy that happened that day when he lost his 2 sons. So today I want to explore Aaron's silence and see what we can learn from it about how we should learn to control our tongues as well. This is a very, very important concept. In fact, the second half of the parasha, which is all about kosher laws, it's the exact same thing. It's telling us to control our tongues, our mouths, this eating apparatus, right? And next week's parasha, next week we have a double parasha, which is called Tazria Metzora. What does that tell us about? What is Metzora? It's people with that biblical leprosy, Lada'at. And we all know what is the source of that disease? Gossip, not being able to control your tongue. And in fact, this is one of the explanations as to why Aaron's 2 sons died at that point when they were brought the strange fire. They say that they were drunk when they entered the tabernacle. How do they derive this? Because exactly after they were dead and exactly after Moses gives his words of remorse to Aaron, God speaks to Aaron and says, here is a law for you Kohanim, you shall not enter my sanctuary after having any alcohol. So once again, it's telling us that the mistake came from the fact that they couldn't control their mouth, their tongue, their palate, their taste, and even their words. So I want to discuss this today because this seems to be a big theme throughout the book of Leviticus. So in chapter 1 of the Pirkei Avot, we get introduced to a bunch of rabbis giving us great advice. Let me run through a few of them, right? It starts off with, in Mishnah 2 at least, it starts off with Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, who tells us that the world stands on 3 things: the Torah, divine worship, and acts of loving kindness, Gimelut Chasidim. Then we learn about a rabbi by the name of Yosef ben Yochanan, who tells us you should not gossip too much with your wife. See, controlling the tongue again. I think he read the story of Adam and Eve and realized what happened over there. Then we get Nitai the Arbalite, who gives us some advice for social distancing. Listen to this. He says, stay far away from an evil neighbor. It's as if he knew we were going to be in quarantine, right? Then you get another rabbi, Avtalyon, who tells us to be careful of what we say because our words can get us into trouble down the line. People can misinterpret what we say and what we teach as teachers, and then that's going to end up with them drinking poisonous water, I think is the way that he puts it. Then we're introduced to the great pairing, Hillel and Shammai, right? We all know them very well, followed by Gamliel, who we are all familiar with, of course, because in the New Testament he's mentioned. He is the teacher of Paul the Apostle. Rabbi Gamliel, by the way, interesting character, right? He is extremely Gentile friendly. It's the weirdest thing. Gamliel was known that he had this servant, a Gentile servant working for him by the name of, I think it was Tabi. Yeah, Tabi. And he admired this Gentile servant of his so much that when he eventually passed away, the Gentile servant, this rabbi, Gamliel, said the mourner's Kaddish for the Gentile. Something that is unheard of. Right? And it's usually going against the grain when you look at all other halachic authorities. That's how much he cared for this Gentile servant of his, that he actually said the mourner's Kaddish for him, right? Furthermore, Gamliel encouraged his disciples who studied under him to actually go and learn Greek philosophy. This is a weird one, right? You know about the other rabbis that talk about, when shall I study Greek? Well, you're allowed to study Greek when the sun doesn't shine and when the sun doesn't go down. When is that? Never, right? Gamliel tells his students that they should actually study Greek theology, Greek philosophy, so that they'll be able to argue with them and teach them about Hashem. So keep in mind that Paul was a student of Gamliel. And now it starts to give us a little bit of a background as to Paul's training. And it explains to us exactly why Paul is in fact the perfect candidate to be chosen as the apostle to the Gentiles. It was part of God's greater plan that Paul would study under Gamliel and learn about how to deal with the halakha and the Gentile world. It was set up from the beginning. He was the perfect man for the job. Anyway, so carrying on with the Pirkei Avot, right after that, after Gamliel's introduced, we get to our final 2 Mishnahs of the Pirkei Avot, and we learn about his son, Shimon ben Gamliel. Right? Now Shimon ben Gamliel would probably then have been friends, possibly with Paul. He was definitely a contemporary of Paul. And it might even have been him who defended Paul when he got arrested by the Sadducees. It's very possible, right? Because remember, they arrested him for preaching about the resurrection. And the Pharisees definitely believe in the resurrection. So if the Sadducees arrest someone for resurrection, they're going to defend him. And it might just have been this very Shimon ben Gamliel. Now, Shimon ben Gamliel, you might recognize him, or you might have forgotten about him, but he's the guy that every year in the temple, when Sukkot came around, we had those parties in the temple every single night of Sukkot, right? The great celebration, the Simchas Bet HaShaveda. And he was the one that was known as the entertainer. He would come into the temple and he would juggle 8 different torches at once to entertain the people. He had another party trick, by the way. He would be able to bend over on the floor, almost kissing the floor, without bending his knees. He would go straight forward like this, land on his thumbs, and be able to push himself back up straight without bending his knees. There's a challenge for you guys to try out during this quarantine. So he was the entertainer, right? Also, you might be familiar with another thing that I think it was him that implemented it. No, it was him. You guys know the story in the Gospels where Yeshua goes into the temple and he throws over the tables of the money changers and he throws over the chairs of the pigeon salesmen, the people that are selling the pigeons? Well, that event must have had a real impact on Shimon ben Gamliel, because later on when he became the head of the Sanhedrin, he actually implemented a law that changed the order of the sacrifices, what was required for a lady who just gave birth, because he had an issue with the pigeon sellers in the temple charging exorbitant prices. They used to charge a whole gold dinar for one pigeon. The point of the pigeon was that it was supposed to be there for those that couldn't afford a lamb or a bull, right? But these guys were exploiting the temple for their own personal gain. And Rabbi Shimon said, before I go to bed tonight, instead of one gold dinar for a pigeon, they'll be charging one silver dinar, right? So he must have been, I want to say, inspired by Yeshua's antics there in the temple, where he pointed out to the people that they are using God's house as a den of robbers. Right, so he became the head of the Sanhedrin at the time, probably the most tumultuous time to be the head of the Sanhedrin, when our temple was destroyed. He had the unenviable task of leading the Jewish nation into exile, right? And he himself eventually ends up being the first of the 10 martyrs that we read about every Yom Kippur. He was the first one that got killed. Okay, so what does he have to say to us in the Pirkei Avot? What does someone who endured a life like this have to teach us as the culmination of his life? The number one saying that he wants to leave with us in the Pirkei Avot, what does he say? Let me read it to you. This is from Pirkei Avot chapter 1 verse 17. He says, all my days I grew up among the sages. Of course, right? He was the son of Gamliel. His father was the head of the Sanhedrin. Everyone around him, every Shabbos table that he was at was all the sages. He says, all my days I grew up among the sages, and I have found nothing better for a person than silence. Exactly what we learned from Aaron in this week's parasha. This is his great message that his whole life encompasses, is that the greatest lesson he learned is silence. Study, he says, is not the most important thing, but actions. What you do is more important than how much you know. Sounds a lot like Paul, by the way. Eh? You can see they must have studied together. And he ends off the Mishnah by saying, whoever indulges in too many words brings about sin. So his number one tip is to shut your mouth, to keep silent, right? Today you've got this thing, people call themselves life coaches, which is the weirdest thing, right? I don't know what a life coach is and where you get a qualification for this. It's a nonsense idea to me. But we have role models, we have rabbis that we can look at, great leaders, and we look at what they say and take that as a life coach unto us. These guys are actually qualified. And this is his lesson for us. The greatest lesson he learned is silence. Now, you might notice a few generations later, there's two rabbis, well, him again, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Garfunkel, that came together and gave us a song about the sound of silence. Right? There's something for you to listen to this week. Now, let's talk about keeping silent. Does it mean that we should stop talking altogether? What is he saying? I mean, you might be asking the question and protesting, well, what about all the other commandments in the Torah that tell us we have to speak? What about the Jewish tradition of asking as many questions as possible to learn? Are we not supposed to be talking non-stop? How can he go and tell us that the greatest lesson he ever learned is silence? Some of you have to do this for a job. For example, my profession is to talk non-stop, right? Other people have what we call verbal diarrhea. They can't control their tongues and stop talking. But then you get those holy individuals who are few and far between, who are able to keep their mouth shut and to not say something every time they get challenged in the mind. But what they do is they keep silent, they accept what they've heard, and they contemplate it. They put their intellect and their spiritual understanding before their physical reaction. That is what we all have to aim for. Sandy always tells the joke here in shul about the person that says, the only time I open my mouth is to switch foots. Because every time he says something, he puts his foot in his mouth, right? There's a similar saying, there's a Yiddish saying that goes as follows. It says, it's better to keep quiet and look stupid than to open your mouth and prove it. So shut up and look clever. Right? I came across an interesting article this week that the 30th president of the United States of America. His name was Calvin Coolidge. This president was known for having few words. In all his press conferences, he almost said nothing. They even gave him a nickname. They called him Silent Cal. Well, Calvin Coolidge, the Silent Cal. And once a reporter came up to him and said to him, listen, I need a favor from you, Mr. President. I made a bet with a friend of mine that I'd be able to get more than 2 words out of you today in the interview. So the president replied, you lose. Anyway, so here's the thing. Does this mean that we should keep our mouths shut and just stop talking altogether and all learn sign language, right? Or lip reading and stop saying words? You know, there's this one tradition that says you only have a certain amount of words in your life that you can use up. And once you've used up those words, it's over for you, right? And those people that believe that tradition, they don't say very much at all, of course. Okay, so what is this talking about? Well, many commentators on this Mishnah of the Pirkei Avot put the Mishnah into its context, explaining it as follows. This is what many commentators do. That it isn't an overall ban of speech. Rather, it means when you get publicly embarrassed, do not reply. Instead, keep silent. That's how they understand this Mishnah. Don't let your anger loosen your tongue. And that's what we learn from Aaron in this week's parasha. He controls his emotion and he doesn't blurt out the first thing that comes to his mind. Instead, Aaron kept silent. So our sages say that when one is insulted by someone and decides not to answer back, that pain and that embarrassment that you're feeling inside actually atone for your own sins. That's how powerful it is to keep silent and not fight back, right? They have a saying that such a person, listen to this, is like the powerful rising sun. What on earth does that mean? It sounds like it comes out of a Karate Kid movie. Such a person is like the powerful rising sun. So this is how they explain it. They give us an analogy. In the creation, God made 2 great lights, okay? One to rule by day and one to rule by night. But have you noticed that sometimes the light that rules by night, the moon, appears in the daytime, right? Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes early in the evening. You can see the sun on that side and you can still see the moon in the sky as well. So what's happening, this is the analogy they give, is that the moon is cocky. It's trying to take over the sun's mission. The sun's mission is to shine by day. So what does the sun do? Does the sun then diminish its light and fight back with the moon and go into the night? No, it doesn't. It just continues to shine brightly forth. And when that happens, it gets rewarded. What is the reward? Well, in the daytime, when we can see the sun and we can see the moon, we can compare the 2 great luminaries. And what can we decide when we compare the 2? That this one is what the Torah calls the greater light. But this cocky little moon over here, this one is the lesser light. And so too, it's a lesson for us in when someone comes and attacks us verbally, if we don't respond, we are like the sun rising, shining forth. Because we are in our silence, doing our job, not fighting back, we are showing the Torah in ourselves. And we are like that sun, which is actually the greater luminary of the 2. So that's how they explain it. It's a pretty cool parable, I think. Right? It will enlighten you. So that is why the Mishnah from the Pirkei Avot goes on to say, what's important is not the studying, but what's important is what you do. Your actions speak louder than your words. That's what the Mishnah is about. Keep silent, let your actions speak for you. Right? That's what you've got to do. Minimize your words and maximize your deeds. Now, the rabbis say that the reason why we blush when someone embarrasses us and our cheeks go red is because blood comes to the forefront of the skin when someone embarrasses us to represent the fact that they have in fact committed murder. That they have just shed blood when they said something bad about us in public. And you know, Yeshua teaches us the same thing, right? He says to us, anyone who calls his fellow a good for nothing or a fool has committed murder and is liable to the fires of Gehenna. Right? Remember, it's in Matthew 5. That whole Matthew 5 is the Pirkei Avot. Go read it this week and see how many connections you can find. So that means that here's the question. What should we do when someone comes to us and publicly embarrasses us? If they commit verbal murder on us, how should we react? Should we fight back? Should we stoop down to their level? Yeshua teaches us, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, give to them the left cheek also. That's a weird verse because people look at it as being weak, right? As being an injustice. In fact, many anti-missionaries take this verse and say, look at this, Jesus is teaching anti-Torah. The Torah says there must be justice. How can you not take someone to court for slapping you, etc., 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 right? But I want to share with you some Talmudic versions of this very saying of Yeshua. For example, here's one from Bava Kama 92b. It says, if your fellow calls you a donkey, that's a rough insult, by the way. If your fellow calls you a donkey, what should you do? Put a saddle on your back. Act like a donkey. That's what they're saying. It's exactly what Yeshua is saying. Right? It's like the same thing about if someone sues you for your jacket, give him your coat also. Go the extra miles, what Yeshua is saying here. And the Talmud is teaching the same thing. Because eventually they realized, hey, these teachings of Yeshua are pretty good. Here's another one from the Talmud, Bava Kama 9:8. It says, if you are struck on the cheek, you must forgive your offender, even if he doesn't ask for forgiveness. Even if he doesn't ask for forgiveness. So it doesn't mean he strikes you on the cheek and you tell him, hey, you must ask for forgiveness. No, you keep silent and you forgive him. Because it's not your job to bring about justice in Hashem's eyes. Right? So Paul quotes this and the Proverbs quotes this many times. In fact, the Talmud actually goes as far as to give a monetary value depending on the type of slap you get on the cheek. If you get slapped on the right cheek, there's a fine of 200 zuz. Right? You guys know the monetary value of zuz? We sang about it on Pesach. My father bought for 2 zuzim, chad gadia, chad gadia. So if you get slapped on the right cheek, the fine is 200 zuz. But if you get slapped on the left cheek, how does someone slap you on the left cheek? Let's say majority of people are right-handed. They have to backhand you. If they slap you with a backhand, the fine is 400 zuz. Why? The Talmud explains, because it is twice as embarrassing if someone backhands you. Because you have embarrassed that person, your sin is twice as much, 2 times greater. So that, it links in very well with what Yeshua said about turning the other cheek. Now, these sayings like turning the other cheek or putting on a saddle if they call you a donkey they're obviously not meant to be taken literally. It doesn't mean if a guy punches you in the cheek, get up and give him the other one. That's not what it means, right? It's a way of explaining. It's a euphemism. What they teach us is to accept the insults that come our way in love and to forgive the person because it's God's will. It's not just to accept it and walk away and say, wow, today I got smacked. But you have to forgive the person as well. That's why Yeshua says, give to him the other cheek as well. Because you're not holding a grudge against that person who's done something bad against you. And that, by the way, is very difficult. So what it's teaching us is do not lose control of your tongue. Right? Control your reactions. Control your speech. And the parasha this week actually teaches us the same thing. Because we see Moses losing control in this week's parasha. Right? After the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, the Torah tells us that Moses searched diligently, darosh darash, he searched and seeked for this sin offering to see what had happened to it. And what did he find out? It was burnt. And what does he do? Moses goes into a rage on Aaron's 2 remaining sons. Right? Eliezer and Itamar. And he shouts at them, what did you guys do? Don't you know you're supposed to eat the meat? Why did you let it burn? And these poor oaks, they weren't expecting to be the ones to do this job, right? It was meant to be their 2 older boots that were supposed to go and do this. And just like that, they died, and these 2 had to now fulfill the roles of the firstborn and the elderly in the family. And yet Moses goes and shouts at them. And the Torah actually says Moses got angry and he shouted at them. He lost control over his tongue. He became angry with them and he went on a rampage against Aaron's sons. Then what happens? Aaron takes him on. This is a little bit of a family feud in this week's parasha. Aaron intervenes and he puts Moses in his place. Right? At the end of it, after Aaron says, we've done all these offerings and yet it still happens to us. And then Moses, what happens to Moses? It says, Moses was satisfied. He realized, oops, should have kept my mouth shut. So what Aaron's teaching him is that his actions, right, shouting at the two sons while they were right there brand new into the service, and the way that he treated them, right, needs to be more important than the minutiae of the legalism of the sacrifices. This is what Aaron is teaching to his older brother Moses. That our actions and how we treat each other, our compassion to our fellow human being is more important than all this little minutiae of making sure you do everything according to this way. Because that's the purpose of the laws and the Torah laws and the mitzvot and the halakha, is to direct us in the way of being and showing compassion to humankind as well. So our sages, they actually look at the story and they actually exonerate Eliezer and Itamar. They find a loophole to say that Eliezer and Itamar were allowed to let it burn because they already ate sacrifice earlier in the day. Therefore, you don't have to eat another sacrifice. So they were completely right in letting it burn. Which means that Moses was completely wrong when he came and accused them. He gave them a false accusation and he let his anger cloud his mind and his judgment. This is Moses, right? The great Moses. And this little section of narrative in the Torah about Aaron's reaction to the death of his sons and Moses being put in his place for not being sensitive to the mourners, it actually puts the entire Torah and our entire faith and our practice of our faith into perspective. Sure, we do try and keep every single mitzvah in the Torah to the best of our ability. We do try to be as scrupulous as we can, and we should. But when it makes us disregard respect for our fellow, then we have missed the Torah's point completely. Even the great Moses, the most humble man on earth, made this mistake of not controlling his tongue and letting his anger flow out immediately when he should have kept silent. It is one of the most powerful moments in the entire Torah, this interaction between Aaron and Moses. So let that be a lesson for us this week. Something we can learn from this parasha. To not let our immediate emotions boil over into the world of speech. I asked earlier a question about that the sages ask about how the punishment of a wrongdoer, like Aaron's two sons who made that mistake, how could that be seen as a good thing for them? That they eventually get drawn close to God because of their mistake. It doesn't make sense. It's a weird thing, right? But think about it this way. When you keep silent, when you turn the other cheek, when you are being insulted, what's happening to the other person? The one that insults us actually wants you to reply and to fight back. They're trying to get your attention, to get something out of you. But when you don't, when you keep silent, it makes them realize what they've actually done. It puts them in no man's land. They thought they were going to start a fight and they were ready for this fight. And then all of a sudden you stepped out of the ring. They don't know what to do. And they stand there alone in their sin and start feeling guilty about what they've done. And what happens when you start feeling guilty? You start thinking about Hashem. That's what guilt does actually. It makes us think about our Creator. And when you're guilty, you realize that you yourself need to turn back to God. You need to do something to draw close to God. So thereby, through your keeping silent when someone insults you, that little momentary suffering that you go through ends up glorifying God by making the sinner or the accuser turn back to Hashem. And that's exactly what happened with Aaron's sons. They drew near to Hashem when they made that mistake. So every year, when Pesach comes around and when Easter is around, we as believers, we get a lot of attacks and a lot of stick, especially in the Messianic movement, about our faith in Yeshua. right? Because it's, Easter time is always around Pesach time. We're always being attacked by the ultra-Orthodox maybe, or the anti-missionaries most of all, or even converts that have converted away from Christianity into Judaism, about how messed up our belief is that Jesus is the Messiah. And it's sad, it's very sad. I don't know how many of you experience this, but I experience this almost every year. And this week I was exposed to it again. I heard some horrible, horrible stuff being said about us as believers and about Yeshua, our Messiah, because of the fact that we proclaim him around the world at this time of year. And it's sickening to hear people say things about Yeshua because he is the Messiah. Especially if Jewish people say it. Because he's the Jewish Messiah. He's going to come back. Why would you say something bad about your Mashiach? It really hurts my heart. Not so much when they say bad stuff about me being a Messianic believer. Right? That couldn't bother me the least. But when they talk about the Messiah himself, it really, really hurts my heart. But then I remember what Yeshua teaches us. Yeshua himself did what Aaron does in this week's parashah. When Yeshua was being taunted, being mocked before his crucifixion by the Sadducean leadership, the kangaroo court they put together to try and accuse him, what did Yeshua say? What was his reaction to their mocking and their scorning? Yeshua kept silent. He kept silent. Why did he keep silent? The Gospels and the book of Acts points out to us that this was what is prophesied about the Messiah in Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53, of course, talking about the suffering servant Messiah, says, he was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to be slaughtered, like a sheep silent before its shearers, he did not open his mouth. And through Yeshua's death and suffering and everything he went through, all that taunting, all that mocking that he went through, the whole world got an invitation to draw near to God. It's an amazing, amazing thing. As Moses comforts his brother Aaron about his two sons, the exact same saying, through those who are brought near to me, I will be consecrated. So let's work on this. Let's be silent at the right time. And by doing so, being steadfast in our faith, by doing so, we proclaim the message of the gospel and we draw people near to Hashem so that, not so that we will look cool and win the fight, but so that we will glorify